Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about the 7 elements of art. Now, these are the building blocks of art, so without these things, we wouldn't have wonderful paintings and photographs and all sorts of things. So, let's get into it. So, the elements of art, it's the visual language used by artists. So, this is a visual language similarly to the way that you might use letters to describe a word. When we think about the visual language used by artists, we're thinking of line, shape, form, value, color, texture, and space. Line is the basic mark that suggests direction. So if we're looking at all of these images here, we see that we're using line in a very interesting way to guide a viewer, to express maybe the way in which something moves, right? So the waves here, the way in which a spider web is built has all these wonderful lines and this circular motion, as well as these trees by this photograph of Ansel Adams that are very vertical, giving us these really nice contrasts between white and dark. There are many different types of lines, as we know. We have horizontal lines and vertical lines, diagonal, parallel, curved, dotted, broken, thick, thin, perpendicular, spiral, swirl, varied, wavy, curled, zigzag, and jagged. So there's all sorts of different types of lines out there, and it just depends on the way in which artists use them to express the image. So shape is the basic outline of an area or figure. So if we look at this tree here, the shape of the trunk, the shape of the roots, and the shape of the top of the tree. So we don't have any detail. We're thinking about the simple outline of an area. So there's many different types of shapes. We have geometric. When we think about geometric shapes, we're thinking about circles and triangles, right? We're thinking about things that are mostly perfect, right? Or have sharp edges or are relatively even. Now, when we think about organic shapes, these are the shapes that we can find in nature, right? So the shape of a leaf or a cloud or maybe some type of fruit. So usually when you get your more blobby shapes, these are organic shapes. Now, if we look at these images here, we see that shape is being used in a number of ways. So we have the shape of this archway that acts as a framing device. And we see that the shape is also mimicked throughout the back here. We can also see that we have this circular shape happening back here. So we can use shapes to really create an interesting object, right, or an interesting image. When we look over at this Pablo Picasso piece, we see that he's using shapes to describe the images, even if it is sort of these rough kind of blobby forms mixed with these geometric shapes, right? And the way that he's using shape to kind of make the image up in the pattern of this suit, things like this. And then we have Yayoi Kusama, who loves using these polka dots and these straight, like all of these really interesting circles on these really blobby, more organic forms mixed with these geometric shapes. Now, value is the lightness or darkness of various areas in an artwork. It's a shift of light to dark, and shading is a good way to think about this. So when we think about value, it's not so much about color, it's all about how light or dark an image is. So if we look at this gradient down here, we see that we have this light area, and then we have the dark, and everything in between is what we call value. Okay, so we have a light value all the way to a dark value. The same thing goes if we look at this color here, which is green. We still have value at the center of the moon here. It is a lighter value. And as we go out to the edges, it's a darker value. Similarly, with this piece by MC Escher, we have a lighter value up here at the top. And as we get closer to this fish down here, we see that it is a darker value. Form happens when we have a shape that is three-dimensional. So form gives shapes depth. The best way to think about what form is shape plus value. So notice when we look over at this piece here by MC Escher again, not only are we using shapes, But the way that he adds value from light to dark within the image makes it seem like it has more depth. Same thing goes for this sculpture here. Instead of it just being a simple shape, we have the dark contrasting areas inside of the indents of this sculpture here, giving us value, which also gives us depth. And another good way to think about this here is using a flat object. So solid color over here is just a shape. But once we start adding different values, we start to get form. Another way to look at this is simple shapes turned into forms here with just by adding a dark side and a light side. Simply gives us a two-dimensional form, 3 dimensions. Color, we all know color. Color is very exciting because it only happens when light is reflected off of an object. Color is what the eye sees as color bounces off of an object, and you see a spectrum of different hues that are then visible. So we love artwork because it can be oftentimes very colorful and very expressive. And so it's really exciting to use and play with color to really grab an audience's attention. Now, space, there's 2 different types of spaces. Now, space is the way openness, depth, distance, or lack thereof is used in an artwork. Traditionally, we're used to thinking about space with a foreground, middle ground, and background. So when we think of the word space here, we're not so much thinking about outer space, but we're just thinking about any space. That could be a kitchen or a bedroom. It could be a field. It could be a basketball court. All of those places are spaces. Now, another way to think about space is what we call positive and negative space. When we look at this image on the right by Robert Mapplethorpe, we can see that we have a positive space, which is the flower here, surrounded by what we call negative space. Negative space is filled, or is just like an empty area filled with just a solid color or space. Think about outer space in this sense. If you were to look at a picture of Earth, space would be the negative space, right? So all that black space, and then Earth would be the positive space. So the thing that has something, right, something that you can see is positive, and then the blankness is the negative space. Texture is the way that something feels and appears to feel like a surface, especially how rough or smooth something is. So it's the feel and appearance of a surface, especially how rough or smooth something is. Now, when we think about art and we think about how do we see, think about how do we look at an image to know what it feels like. So artists use texture to describe something that might feel rough or smooth or furry to kind of describe either emotion or to try and enhance that visual experience. For example, if we look at this cup covered in fur, we're using that reference for a cup that we use for drinking, and we associate drinking something out of a cup and a spoon for stirring. But what happens when we start to think about drinking out of a cup covered in fur? As well as this image created by Cecile Buller. If we look at the texture in which she has used her chisel to make her marks, it's very textural, it's very rigid, but the way that she uses mark making really changes that texture to give it depth and value and make it really quite exciting. So when we look at some of these images, really be thoughtful of what are the elements of art. Do we see line, shape, form, color, value, texture, or space? And if so, how do we see them?